War affects the North. We're definitely going to see Union successes in 1863, and a lot of this is because of the federal government expanding its bureaucracy, mostly to wage war more efficiently, as well as passing legislation that really broadens the federal power, which means they can further the war effort. This is also going to help the Northern economy boom, and we're going to see, as a result of some of this, women entering the workforce in growing numbers. But we also are going to see things like labor unrest and class and racial tensions even in the North. So the thing is, before the war, the federal government rarely actually affected citizens' lives directly. But now we're seeing, with the Civil War being raised, with the Civil War, I should just say, the federal government has to raise troops, protect territory, mobilize the economy, all for war. And this really required a strong and active centralized government. Republicans are going to dominate in this government. Almost immediately, Lincoln is going to have to use executive authority to try to suppress opposition to the war effort in North. There were many Northerners who said, let the South secede. We don't want them. We don't want to fight a war to keep them in it. Still, that's not all the North by any means. And so Lincoln is going to issue a temporary suspension of the right of habeas corpus, which is the constitutional protection against illegal imprisonment, which basically means this allowed the government to arrest any kind of suspected Confederate agent and hold them indefinitely. The suspension became more permanent come September of 1862. Now, as much as that might sound really scary, actually Lincoln does a fairly good job upholding basic American civil liberties. You do have like authorities shutting down a handful of newspapers here and there, but most of the time it was temporary shutdowns. And actually Lincoln's administration made no attempt to like control the news process or subvert the electoral process. We're going to see that throughout the entirety of the Civil War, Republicans are going to retain control of Congress, though they do lose several seats to Democrats as the war goes on. In 1864, Lincoln is also going to win re-election in a hard-fought contest. I'm going to talk about that politically later more, but I just want to kind of go into the federal government overall. And so we're really going to see the Republicans in Congress, along with Lincoln's administration, are really going to use the government to enhance, more than anything else, individual opportunities, especially opportunities out in the West. So this is going to be acts like the Homestead Act of 1862. This provided homesteads of 160 acres of free land in exchange for improving the land within 5 years of the grant. So that's a lot of opportunity for a lot of people. Then there's like things like the Land Grant College Act of 1862. This awarded proceeds from the sale of public lands to the states they were in for the establishment of like agricultural and mechanical colleges. So we're looking at now we can have our states have these colleges, help improve society within the states, agriculturally based as well as mechanically. So, yeah. We also get like a protective tariff that same year. And then we have the National Banking Act of 1863. This replaced the banknotes of individual states with a uniform national currency. The thing is, all of these things helped sustain the Union war effort and really enjoyed widespread support. What did not enjoy widespread support is going to be Congress passes the first national conscription law in 1863. This is basically the federal draft. Almost immediately, we're going to see evasion, obstruction, and weak enforcement of this conscription law, threatening to undermine it. Conflicts would sometimes erupt into violence, and in fact, the worst draft riot is going to be in New York City in July of 1863. The New York Draft Riot. This began when a mostly Irish mob protesting conscription burned the federal marshal's headquarters. But you can see a lot of like racial and class antagonism joining in this anti-draft anger, because this mob goes on a rampage through the city streets, and like you see the racial antagonism by rioters hanging 2 Black New Yorkers that wandered into their path, and they also burned down the colored orphan asylum. City officials and police stood by, and they were either unable or they were unwilling to stem this riot. And in fact, some even joined in, and this riot claimed over 100 lives. It would only be quelled literally by the Union Army that was actually fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg. The draft would end up resuming a month later. This is when I talk about a movie again. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend watching Gangs of New York. The finale of Gangs of New York is literally the New York draft riot. And there are definitely parts of this that you can see they do very well in the scene in the movie. Ignore the big weapons. That is not historically accurate at all. But other parts, like you can see the racial antagonisms, and that like firefighters like join in the mob and everything like that, and a lot of the Irish in particular are within the mob. You see those in the movies, so it's a great visual representation if you're one person that likes watching movies. And I believe Gangs of New York is on Netflix right now, although I should warn you, it is R-rated. So we also have the Northern economy. So in the couple months preceding the war, there is an initial downturn in the economy, but that's not really a surprise. The thing is, generally there are small downturns in the economy when people don't know what's going to happen next. And when it's in months preceding a war, that's a great example of people not sure what's going to happen next. Another example that you can definitely see like in modern day is almost always in the month or so leading up to a presidential election, you'll see a bit of an economic, not recession, but downturn, because people are unsure who's going to become the next president. However, once the United States is actually involved in the Civil War, the economy is going to pick up quickly in the North. We're going to see things like high tariffs and massive federal spending making up for the loss of the southern markets, as well as the closing of the Mississippi River, because people can't really ship down the Mississippi River when it's going to go through southern territory. Profits actually skyrocketed for certain businesses. New industries would boom, and a lot of this is because we get things like new inventions increasing manufacturing efficiency. A great example of that is like the technological advances really greatly increasing the North's garment factories' output. We also see things like the production of petroleum as a lubricant during the Civil War. There's definitely a loss of manpower because men are going off to fight in the Civil War, and yet Northern agriculture actually grew during the Civil War. And a lot of this is because of those technological developments where machines could replace men on farms. And actually, the manufacturers of such machinery are going to become quite wealthy. On top of that, there's actually crop failures in Europe during this time, which is going to dramatically increase the demand for American grain. Now, when we're looking at labor, we have to think about supply and demand. There's a short supply of men because men are off fighting the war and immigration is down, partly because generally people don't move to countries that are in the middle of a civil war. And so but demand is staying the same on some level. And so since the supply is low but demand is staying the same, you get wage increases. But actually the prices of items rose faster. But because there's a demand for men that are in short supply, the trade union movement, which had suffered a setback with the Depression of 1857, is really going to be revived. In fact, by 1865, it's something like more than 200,000 Northern workers belong to labor unions. Employers would end up having to hire strike breakers to break up strikes, and usually they purposely hire strike breakers who is a person that basically works or is employed by a place of others who are on strike, thus making the strike ineffectual. The thing is, a lot of these employees would purposely hire African American strikebreakers, and this sparked riots in places like New York City and Cincinnati, partly because we already have the racial antagonism with the Civil War, because there was a lot of Northerners who blamed African Americans for the Civil War, unfairly so, but were like, oh, if you weren't here, then we wouldn't have to go to war to free the slaves. Yeah, I know it's kind of complicated reasoning, but keep in mind the North is just as racist as the South. It's just more Northerners were against the institution of slavery, per se. And so we are definitely seeing some deep social and ethical problems, but these are going to become even more pronounced really in the decades after the Civil War. At the time of the Civil War, economic development basically outweighs a lot of these negative consequences that we're seeing come about. Which brings us to women. So more than 100,000 Northern women are going to take jobs in like factories, sewing rooms, even like arsenals during the Civil War. There's some really sad incidences where they'd work and their dresses would drag through the gunpowder on the floor of arsenals and everything and actually cause a spark to happen and like explosions and death and everything like that. Really fascinating, but very sad. But what this really means is we're seeing women performing tasks that were previously reserved for men, but of course these women are being paid less to do so. So on one hand, it's opportunity for them, but they're not necessarily being paid what they probably should have been. The biggest opportunity, though, for women really to serve in the war effort was in nursing. However, when they were nurses, basically a lot of times doctors thought very little of their ability to provide actual medical care and viewed these women nurses as more like nurturing morale boosters. Now, that being said, women still did provide actual medical care, such as like most famously was Clara Barton, who treated soldiers on the battlefield very much at peril to her own safety. We are definitely going to see that there's an indication of change and new economic opportunities for women, though, when after the war, 8 previously all-male state universities actually would start admitting women. So I ask you this as a part of your journal. Due to how affected the North is by the Civil War, could this have caused them to lose the war? Basically, do you think the North could have lost the war based off of some of the problems that they faced?